Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Oh, hello. Right. A bankrupt philosopher approached Alexander the Great for help. Alexander, after hearing his story, told him to go to his treasury and to take anything he wanted to. The bankrupt man asked for £10,000, an exorbitant amount. The treasurer, unsurprisingly, refused and went back to Alexander, who said, "Let the money be paid immediately. I am delighted with this man's way of thinking. He has done me singular honour by the largeness of his request, for he shows the high idea he has conceived both of my superior wealth and my royal magnificence." This morning, we're going to look at David in 2 Samuel 15, once again, yes, in the midst of his own bankruptcy. Then we'll ask how, like David, we can hope for God's best when we find ourselves at our worst. Finally, we'll explore what Samuel 23 tells us about the God of David's confidence. Gordon spoke so ably of David last week, didn't he? Showing us David's heart after God as a son and his hardness of heart as a father. And the contrast pointed vividly to both the assets and flaws of his character. Samuel offers us a parabolic curve revealing his journey with God as King of Israel. David's rise from a lowly shepherd from Samuel 1:16 to 2 Samuel 6. Then David, the obedient son and king, 2 Samuel chapters 7 to 10. David's sin and their consequence from chapter 11 begin the gradual descent to where we find ourselves now in chapter 15. The consequences of David's sins are being worked out as seen in the rape of Tamar by her half-brother Amnon, the avenging of this by her full brother Absalom, and finally Absalom's takeover bid of the kingdom. David's responses often seem misplaced throughout these events. He does not punish Amnon nor lift up Tamar. David grieves endlessly over Amnon's murder to the point of embarrassment for some of his servants, while banishing the son who sought justice for his own daughter's rape. In short, as Gordon pointed out so well last week, David sought to be the father on his own terms. He made a total mess of things, impacting his own life, his children, and the lives of those around him. And I don't know about you, but last week I felt my own sin in my throat and the weight of my own wrongs on my heart. And many of us were right there, weren't we? We know ourselves that we've swept things under the carpet, hoping things that would settle down, leaving no space for pain to be resolved openly. We've sometimes placed our allegiances with the less messy option, only to have it blow up in our faces later. We've kept the status quo to avoid rocking the boat, while knowing that pain and injury continues with our knowledge. David may point to the extremes of our nature, but to ours, yours and mine, he indeed points. And at that moment, there appears no salve for our sin. There's nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape, and no means to justify ourselves. And this was where we left David last week. Now, this David is the same David that then goes on to write, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." How do you go from experiencing the full weight of your sin to having a heart that rests confidently in God's generous goodness? How many of us would love to do a 1080 like this? How many want to make this transition but find ourselves stuck in varying degrees? Perhaps you're aware of that stuckness right now. Perhaps you have things that pop up periodically that prevent you from completely resting in God's love for you. So how did David manage this shift? Listen to these words from Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Cleanse me with hyssop and I will be clean. Wash me and I'll be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict, and justified when you judge. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart you, God, will not despise. David, at his lowest point, looks up to his father and sees the mess of his self-will run riot. David, with a little help from Nathan, admits the whole sordid truth in confession to God. He bears his broken and contrite heart, and there he receives forgiveness from God and is able to forgive himself. And sometimes this is the hardest part of the deal. We know that God forgives, but then find ourselves unable to forgive where he has. But it's in this transaction of dual forgiveness, and sometimes tripartite if we're forgiving others, that David receives peace to his heart, mind and body. Despite the chain of events set in motion by his sin, he knows that he himself is set free from condemnation. Certainly, he must live with the consequences of his actions, but not his blood guilt. Restored from crippling pride and shame, he is able to receive fully from his Father. But what does this state actually look like? How will we in the same situation know if we have been restored? Well, that is where Psalm 23 comes in. David is believed to have written this psalm around this time of his life. Here in David's psalm, we see what a barrierless trust in God looks like from the sheep's perspective. And I don't know if you'd noticed that before. The term shepherd in this psalm is not new in Old Testament literature, but it is in fact unique in its use of the word. It is the only time that the word my is used in conjunction with it. God cares for every person as though he cared for that person alone. The sheep knows its helplessness and need, and thus is wholly dependent on the character of the one in whom it trusts. The God which led the Israelites throughout the desert for 40 years without lack is now the same God whom David can say, I shall not want. In the Gospels, Jesus is concerned deeply with people's physical, mental and spiritual needs. The whole range of man's experience comes under his loving and watchful eyes. And in fact, God states his reputation on this. The greatest example, of course, is Jesus, the shepherd, who lays down his life for us. David, having been forgiven and put right with God, is now free to receive all that God longs to provide for him. This is the truth of the 23rd Psalm for us as well. Yet many of us can be afflicted with what one author calls practical atheism. That is, we worry about, control and manipulate, all trying to manage our own needs. We spend our days feeling overwhelmed by all that we must do, or feel, and sometimes both, that we are unworthy of God's help. Yet the same God who leaves the 99 to find the one lost sheep is the same God we encounter here in Psalm 23. Those of us afflicted with this practical atheism, and I put my hand up, struggle with a mistrust of God's goodness towards us. Jesus either won't care for us, we believe, or others as well as we can, or that he is wrong in his judgment to love us so generously. We say in any number of ways, I don't want Jesus to be my shepherd. And if we're honest, we all have areas where we prefer ourselves, someone else, or something other to be our shepherd. Verse 1 to 3 shows God's good pleasure to provide for us. And now in verse 4 to 5, we see that Jesus also accompanies us in times of trouble. God's companionship transforms every situation we encounter. It does not mean that there are no deathly valleys, darkness or enemies, but there are none that we will have to face on our own. We are not abandoned by God. Rather, his presence, which led us by still waters, now guides us in times of despair. Where God provided so that we might not want, now he comforts that we might not fear. And indeed, it is the vitality of relationship, not simply some God-shaped shadow, that offers comfort. Note the change in pronouns from he to you. This is the high point of David's confidence. This is his personal account of the rod which beat away his enemies and the staff which kept him from straying too far. For David, this deep and living companionship is a safe place in the midst of the crisis he now finds himself in. But more than this, it is a surrendering of his demands to be led by only safe paths. David learnt to surrender his fears and trust God wherever he led him. Jesus, the true friend, has our best interests at heart and not just our wants. He longs for us to know the reality that there is nothing deeper or wider or higher that can separate us from his love. Nothing that can prevent us from continuing to become more like him. And the following article illuminates the point well. I have often thought it must have been very real during the war when Christian people in Britain came to church after a bombing raid and sat down to a sacramental meal at the Lord's table. God did not protect them against their enemy, but he did sustain and comfort them in the presence of their enemies. This is the effect of God in our experience, to protect us not against danger, but against fear, not against hurt, but against cynicism, not against failure, but against pessimism, not against illness and disease, but against the spirit of complaining, not against bereavement and sorrow, but against hopelessness and despair. The imagery now shifts in verse 6 to that of a royal host. Thus, the sheep is in the care of a shepherd who has the resources and power to be exceedingly generous. And again, there are links back to the Exodus. I haven't put a slide for that. In Psalm 78:19, the Israelites speak against God, saying, can you move to the next slide? Thank you. Can God spread a table in the desert? David responds with a resounding yes. Not only can he spread a table, but he can spread one so plentifully that not only will I have no want, my cup will overflow. His presence with us is so immediate that not only will we feel safe in the valley of death, but even in the presence of our very enemies. God offers a superfluous love, providence and protection in all areas of our life. No longer is David concerned about his enemies following him. Rather, he is pursued by goodness and mercy and chooses to dwell in this place evermore. That is, David receives the truth that he is not a victim of his circumstances, but that he is deeply embraced by one who can turn all things for good. Coming back from Portland last year, I found myself complaining to the Lord about my flights. The first flight had been delayed, and this affected my further 2 flights with several long sit-ins at airports. My complaint went something like this: Lord, I have always been poor. I have never had enough, and it isn't fair that even now I don't have much money. And I have fundraised for this trip, and because of that I have chose the cheapest tickets I could find. I saved $1,000 on these tickets, and now I'm paying with it with fatigue and frustration. And it's just not fair. I wish I could pay for things myself and then I could take direct flights. And I harped on for quite some time in this manner while feeling the impact of my poverty. Finally, I gave pause for God's comfort to come. And his response to me was this: I never said you had to buy those tickets. You never even asked me. I could have given you any ticket I wanted to, but you didn't even come. This has got nothing to do with your lack of money, but all about your lack of vision for my generosity towards you. Slightly aghast, I quickly confessed my sin and promised to consult the Lord how he'd like to provide for me in the future. So no longer are we to be determined by our difficulties. Instead, we are pursued by the goodness of God. Jesus, speaking of himself as the true shepherd in John 10:10, says, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. Now, we'll be sadly disappointed if we think that Jesus refers only to material fullness. A fullness of life is to know with confidence that your Heavenly Father has got your back in every situation, knows all you need, and desires to give you good things, even his very self. We get it all, and incredibly, this all will last us through eternity. God is well pleased to lavish his goodness on us, no matter where we find ourselves. And when we find ourselves far away from God's will for our lives, God has promised us forgiveness and restoration through the forgiveness of sin. In Psalm 23, David shares his confidence of God as shepherd, companion, and royal host. This much-loved psalm acts both as a promise as well as a measure of our restored relationship with God. Our ability to confidently rest in God's care is directly related to how we answer this question: how much do we really want God to be our shepherd?
Will you please stand, and we affirm the faith in the words of the night.